On the morning of August 13th, 2018, the quiet suburb of Frederick, Colorado, looked like every other peaceful American neighborhood. Sunlight on trimmed lawns, birds cutting through the stillness. Nothing suggested that inside one of those beautiful homes, a nightmare had already unfolded, one disguised for years behind smiles, Facebook posts, and picture-perfect family videos. Chris Watts had always seemed like the ideal husband, soft-spoken, devoted, a father who lifted his daughters into his arms with the kind of gentle pride people admired. And Shannon, radiant, driven, warm, shared every piece of their seemingly blessed life online. Thrive videos filled with positivity, birthday clips, family trips, matching outfits on Bella and Celeste. To anyone watching, they were the suburban dream. But behind those curated moments, something poisonous had been growing. Chris had drifted into an affair with a coworker, Nicole Kessinger. To her, he played the role of a man, trapped in a loveless marriage, desperate for escape. But in reality, he was suffocating under secret debt resentment and a selfish desire to start over without consequences. Shannon, pregnant with their son Nico, felt that distance. She told friends something was wrong. Chris had gone cold, quiet, unreachable. The night she returned home from a business trip, exhausted but hopeful, was the last night she would ever spend alive. The next morning, her friend Nicole Atkinson, worried when she couldn't reach her, called police for a welfare check. That one instinct, that small moment of intuition, cracked open the façade Chris had carefully built. When officers arrived, Chris greeted them calmly, too calmly, arms folded, voice trembling just enough to imitate fear. "I have no idea where they are," he said. But he already knew. Security footage from a neighbor's camera showed him backing his work truck into the garage at dawn, something he had never done before, and loading heavy objects into the back. Those were the last moments Shannon, Bella, and Celeste were ever seen. He failed a polygraph test. His story unraveled. And then in one chilling moment, the mask fell off. Chris first tried to blame Shannon, claiming she had harmed their daughters, and he reacted in rage. A desperate lie. But the truth was so much darker. In the early morning hours after an argument, Chris strangled Shannon in their bed. When Bella and Celeste woke up crying, he told them their mother was asleep. Then, he wrapped Shannon's body in a sheet, placed her in his truck, and drove 40 miles to an isolated oil site, with his daughters still alive in the back seat. There, he buried his wife in a shallow grave and ended the lives of his little girls before placing their bodies inside separate oil tanks. Nicole Kessinger's internet history showed searches for wedding dresses and how to prepare for a new life weeks before the murders. Chris believed he could erase his family, like deleting a photo that no longer fit his new image. He wanted a clean slate, a fresh start, without responsibility, without guilt, without the people who loved him most. When the truth finally came out, the world's horror turned to fury. Every clip of Chris pleading on television for his family's safe return became unbearable to watch lies spoken by a man who already knew exactly where they were. In November 2018, Chris Watts pleaded guilty to 9 counts of murder. He received 5 life sentences with no possibility of parole. Today, he sits in isolation at Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. A man whose face once represented the perfect family, now remembered as one of the most disturbing domestic killers in modern American history. He didn't just destroy his family. He shattered the illusion that evil is easy to see. Sometimes it smiles for the camera. For a century, the Murdaugh name carried weight like royalty in South Carolina's Low Country. 3 generations of men, powerful solicitors, controlled the legal system itself. They decided who was charged, who walked free, and whose secrets stayed buried. It was a dynasty built on influence, privilege, and the quiet confidence of men who believed the rules simply did not apply to them. At the center of that legacy stood Alex Murdaugh, charismatic, connected, and raised to believe his family was untouchable. He lived on a massive 1700-acre estate called Moselle with his wife Maggie and their 2 sons Buster and Paul. To the outside world, the Murdaughs looked like the Southern ideal wealth tradition and generational success. But behind those red brick family portraits, the empire was already cracking. The first fracture came through Paul, the reckless, hard-drinking youngest son. In February 2019, 9-year-old Paul crashed a family boat into a bridge piling while heavily intoxicated, killing his friend Mallory Beach. Her death stunned the community, and yet, almost immediately, Alex moved to contain the damage, calling in favors, making quiet phone calls, pressuring witnesses. He'd done this before, but this time, the world was watching. Rumors began to swirl. How many crimes had the Murdaugh family buried over the years? How many tragedies had been swept under their influence? Then on June 7, 2021, everything collapsed. Alex called 911 from Moselle's dog kennels, claiming he had just discovered Maggie and Paul's death. His voice trembled, playing the role of a broken husband and grieving father. For a moment, the community rallied around him, but investigators immediately sensed something was wrong. Alex said he wasn't at the kennels that night, but Paul's phone held a secret. Seconds before the murders, Paul unknowingly recorded a Snapchat video. In the background, clear as day, was his father's voice, the same father who claimed he hadn't been there. Digital forensics shredded Alex's alibi, and as investigators dug deeper, an even darker truth emerged. Alex had been stealing for years millions of dollars from his law firm, from clients, from settlements meant for widows and orphans. He was drowning in secret debt, lawsuits were closing in, and the Beach family's wrongful death case threatened to expose everything. Prosecutors would later argue that Alex killed his wife and son to buy time to create sympathy, to distract from the financial collapse closing in on him, a horrifying act of self-preservation. And the evidence, it was devastating. Phone data placed him at the kennels at the exact time of the murders. Blood spatter suggested he was near Paul when the fatal was fired. And under pressure, Alex admitted to dozens of financial crimes, though he continued to deny the murders. The trial became a national obsession, a Southern dynasty on trial for its darkest truth. On March 2, 2023, after 6 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Alex Murdaugh was found guilty of murdering Maggie and Paul. The judge looked him in the eye and said, "The monster you become when you take 20, 40, 50 opioid pills a day is terrifying." Alex received 2 consecutive life sentences. But the story didn't end. In 2024 and 2025, new indictments stacked up: fraud, money laundering, theft, conspiracy, more than a century's worth of crimes, falling out of the shadows of a once powerful legacy. Today, the Murdaugh name, once feared, respected, and untouchable, has become a symbol of corruption and collapse. Moselle has been sold, the family is fractured. And Buster, the surviving son, lives in isolation, haunted by what remains of a dynasty that destroyed itself from within. Because Alex didn't just kill his wife and son, he killed the illusion of the untouchable American family. For nearly 2 decades, Jean-Claude Romand lived a lie so perfect, so polished, that not even his closest family suspected the truth. To his friends, he was a brilliant doctor at the World Health Organization in Geneva. To neighbors, he was polite, soft-spoken, a devoted husband who took his children skiing in the Alps. His life looked calm, successful, respectable. But that life did not exist. None of it. Beneath the surface, Jean-Claude was a man held together by a single thread, a lie he spun in 1975 when he failed an exam at medical school and decided he simply couldn't face the humiliation of telling the truth, so he forged a new reality. Instead of admitting failure, he pretended he had passed. Then he pretended he was continuing. Then he pretended he had graduated. And somehow, for 18 years, that lie became his identity. Every morning, he put on a white coat, kissed his wife Florence and their children goodbye, and drove toward the Swiss border. But instead of entering the WHO headquarters, he parked near the woods, wandering aimlessly along trails, sitting in cafes reading medical journals to maintain the illusion. His entire work life was fiction, long days spent hiding, pretending, keeping up the performance. Money was the glue. To sustain the lifestyle of a high-level physician, Romand began quietly stealing from those closest to him. He convinced family and friends to invest in Swiss financial accounts he claimed to manage through the WHO. It was all a scam. They trusted him completely, parents, in-laws, best friends, and he used their money to keep the fantasy alive. But by the early 1990 seconds, cracks were forming. People wanted proof, documents, reports, returns. A business associate asked for verification of an investment. Florence began questioning his schedule. His parents expressed concern. After nearly 2 decades of deception, his world was about to collapse. And instead of facing the truth, he chose a path so horrifying, so incomprehensible, that it would shock France to its core. On January 9, 1993, Jean-Claude committed the unthinkable. In the quiet hours of the morning, he struck Florence as she slept, killing her instantly. Then he moved to his children's rooms. 10-year-old Antoine and 7-year-old Caroline were asleep when he ended their lives. He covered their bodies as if tucking them in for a final time. Then he drove to his parents' home in the countryside. He shot both of them, and then the family dog. Every person who knew the truth or might uncover it was erased. When he returned home, Romand scattered pills around the floor, poured gasoline across the rooms, and set the house on fire, planning to die in the blaze. But firefighters arrived too quickly. They dragged him from the burning ruins of his double life alive. Investigators soon uncovered the staggering truth. He had never been a doctor, never worked at the WHO, never earned a salary, never attended a single meeting. His business trips were nights spent sleeping inside his car or walking through shopping centers until they closed. The money he stole, over £1 million francs, was gone. Psychiatrists described him as a man trapped inside a fantasy so deep he no longer understood where the lie ended and reality began. A pathological liar, they said, one who chose annihilation over exposure. France was hypnotized by the case. The idea that a man could build an entire world out of imagination and then burn it down when the truth closed in. The trial became one of the most watched in the nation's history. In 1996, Romand was convicted of 5 murders and sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 22 years. He served 26 years. In 2019, he was quietly released under strict supervision into a monastery-run facility near Lyon. His story remains one of the most haunting explorations of deception ever told, a question that lingers long after the facts settle. How far will a person go to protect a lie? For Jean-Claude Romand, the answer was as far as destroying the only real things he ever had: his family. To the people of Amstetten, Austria, Josef Fritzl was nothing more than an ordinary man, a retired engineer, a strict but stable father, a quiet neighbor who tended his garden and kept to himself. His house sat on a peaceful, tree-lined street, the kind of street where nothing truly horrifying should ever happen. But beneath that calm suburban home was a secret so monstrous, so unfathomable, that it would stun the world and become one of the darkest crimes in modern history. It began in 1984, when Josef's 8-year-old daughter Elizabeth suddenly vanished. Her parents reported her missing, claiming she had run away to join a cult. Police believed the story. Then, weeks later, a letter arrived written in Elizabeth's handwriting saying she was safe and didn't want to be found. Her mother cried with relief. But the letter was a lie. Elizabeth wrote it while trapped in the darkness because Josef forced her to. For years he had been preparing a hidden cellar beneath the house. Behind a heavy steel door was a maze of soundproof rooms, a makeshift fallout shelter. But in truth, it was a prison built with terrifying precision, a place where he intended to keep his daughter forever. On August 28, 1984, Josef lured Elizabeth into the basement asking for help carrying a door. When she stepped inside, he locked it behind her. For the next 24 years, she would never see daylight again. What happened inside that cellar defies imagination. Josef visited almost every night, bringing food supplies and imposing what the court later described as unspeakable abuse. Elizabeth gave birth to 7 children in that underground world. 3 of them, Kirsten, Stefan, and Felix, lived their entire lives without sunlight, never seeing the sky, never stepping onto grass. The other 3 were taken upstairs by Josef, who told his wife Rosemary that the infants had been left at their doorstep by Elizabeth, who was struggling to care for them. Rosemary believed him. Everyone believed him. The entire deception survived because Josef controlled both worlds, the kind patriarch above the tyrant and captor below. He forged letters, fabricated stories, and manipulated every question from authorities and social workers. Even when people wondered why abandoned babies kept appearing at his home, he always had an explanation. For decades, no one saw the truth. Then, in April 2008, the nightmare finally began to crack. 19-year-old Kirsten, the eldest child born in captivity, became critically ill. Elizabeth begged Josef to get medical help. Eventually, fearing she might die, he brought Kirsten to the hospital. Doctors were shocked. The girl was pale, malnourished, and clearly had not lived in normal conditions. They appealed for her mother to come forward. The next day, Elizabeth appeared with Josef at her side. But this time someone listened. Police separated her from Josef, and she finally spoke. "My father did this to me." Those 6 words shattered a 24-year illusion. Police raided the Fritzl home, discovered the concealed entrance, and descended into the suffocating windowless cellar. They found old toys, drawings on the walls, a tiny sink, remnants of 2 decades of stolen childhood. It was a world frozen in time, a world only Josef controlled. When confronted, Josef confessed without hesitation. He claimed he built a family underground. He spoke in twisted logic, distancing himself from the pain he caused. But investigators knew the truth. This was not impulse nor madness. It was control, obsession, and absolute evil carried out over half a lifetime. In 2009, Josef Fritzl was charged with murder of the newborn, who died without medical help, rape, enslavement, and incest. He pleaded guilty and received life imprisonment in a secure psychiatric facility. His wife divorced him immediately. Elizabeth and her surviving children were given new identities and moved to a protected location where they began the long, impossible task of rebuilding their lives. Even today, Fritzl remains under maximum security, his appeals repeatedly denied. Austrian courts, in 2024 and 2025, refused his request to leave the psychiatric facility, citing ongoing danger and manipulative behavior. The story horrified a nation and the world, not only because of what Josef did, but because of where he did it. A quiet street, a normal home, a father who for 24 years built a world of darkness beneath a world of light. Josef Fritzl became the embodiment of evil hiding in plain sight, a man who constructed his own personal hell and forced his daughter and their children to live inside it. From the outside, the Turpin family looked like an American miracle. A smiling mother and father, 13 children dressed in identical outfits, picture-perfect trips to Disneyland, coordinated church portraits, a spotless suburban home in Paris, California. On social media, they appeared wholesome, almost angelic. A large, God-fearing family devoted to faith and discipline. But behind those carefully staged photos was a nightmare the world would later call the House of Horrors. David and Louise Turpin married young, both raised in extremely strict religious households. As their family grew, so did their obsession with absolute control. They withdrew their children from school, isolated them from the outside world, and moved from Texas to California, cutting off relatives and building a world only they controlled. Neighbors rarely saw the children, and when they did, the kids were thin, pale, silent, walking in a single file line like ghosts moving through a world they didn't belong to. Inside the house, the illusion shattered. The Turpin home was filthy, filled with rotting food, garbage, and a suffocating smell. The children were confined to their rooms for days or weeks. Some were chained to their beds as punishment. They were allowed to eat once a day, small bites of peanut butter or a slice of bread, while David and Louise ordered takeout feasts for themselves. Their bodies grew skeletal, their hair tangled, their teeth decayed from malnutrition. And the abuse wasn't sudden. It evolved slowly, wrapped in a twisted shell of religion and discipline. Louise spent hours online, comparing her family to others she envied. She forced the children to memorize Bible verses while starving them. David filmed the children walking in formation, documenting their suffering as if it were choreography. For years, the children endured this captivity in silence. But on January 14th, 2018, everything changed. In the early hours of the morning, 7-year-old Jordan Turpin summoned all her courage, climbed out of a window, and ran into the dark night with a cell phone she had secretly hidden for months. Her voice shook as she dialed 911. "I just ran away from home," she said. "My parents are abusing us. My 2 little sisters are chained up." She had never been outside alone. She didn't know the name of her street, but she knew this was her only chance to live. When police entered the house, even veteran officers were stunned. They found the other children, ages 2 to 29, emaciated, terrified, and unfamiliar with basic vocabulary. One officer asked a child, "Do you take any medication?" The child answered, "What's medication?" A younger sibling was chained to a bed. Another had bruises and rope marks. Almost all were severely malnourished. David and Louise were arrested that same morning. At first they acted confused, insisting it was all a misunderstanding. But the evidence was overwhelming. Investigators uncovered years of torture, starvation, psychological manipulation, isolation, and deliberate cruelty. In court, David sat silent. Louise wept. The children's testimonies were so painful the judge closed the courtroom. On February 22, 2019, David and Louise Turpin each pleaded guilty to torture, false imprisonment, and endangerment. They were sentenced to 25 years to life. But the world was unprepared for what came next. After escaping their parents, the Turpin children were placed into the foster system. And in 2024, a devastating scandal erupted. The foster parents entrusted with caring for several Turpin children were themselves charged with severe abuse and sexual assault. They were convicted later that year. The world watched in disbelief. The children had escaped one nightmare, only to fall into another. Today, many of the Turpin siblings are rebuilding their lives slowly, bravely. Some attend college, some work full-time. And Jordan, the hero who made the 911 call, now uses her voice to advocate for survivors everywhere. She once said she practiced dialing emergency numbers for years, long before she knew what freedom felt like. The Turpin case remains one of the most haunting reminders of hidden family evil in modern America. It exposed how carefully staged photos, religious language, and the illusion of perfection can hide unimaginable cruelty. Because sometimes the brightest family portraits conceal the darkest truths. To most people in Columbia, Illinois, Chris Coleman looked like the embodiment of faith and family. A handsome father, a devoted husband, a man who traveled the world as the head of security for Joyce Meyer Ministries, one of the largest Christian televangelist empires in America. His life appeared blessed. A beautiful wife, Sherry, 2 energetic sons, Gavin and Garrett, a 6-figure salary, a spotless home in an upscale neighborhood. But behind that polished Christian image lived a man suffocating under hypocrisy, one who would destroy the very family he pretended to cherish. Chris and Sherry had been high school sweethearts. She adored him. She believed deeply in their marriage, their faith, and the life they were building. But Chris wanted something else, something newer, younger, more exciting. By 2008, he was having an affair with Tara Lintz, a friend of Sherry's from Florida. Text messages between them later revealed that Chris had promised Tara he would divorce his wife and start a new life with her. They exchanged intimate messages, photos, and dreams of a future without Sherry and the boys. But divorce would ruin Chris. He feared losing his job at Joyce Meyer Ministries. He feared losing his reputation. And more than anything, he feared losing the money and image he'd worked so hard to build. So he crafted a plan, twisted, deliberate, and cold. In late 2008, Chris began receiving threatening emails. Anonymous messages warning that his work with Joyce Meyer was making someone angry. "Tell Chris his family is dead," one read. "I am going to kill them all." Chris showed the emails to his bosses. They took the threats seriously, but something about them felt off. Investigators later noticed that the writing style sounded familiar, like something Chris himself might have typed. Still, the internet threats created the perfect setup: a narrative, a villain, a way to stage what he already intended to do. On May 5, 2009, just before dawn, Chris called police, saying he couldn't reach his wife or sons. Officers arrived at the Coleman home and broke through a window. What they found inside was horrifying. Sherry, Gavin, and Garrett were dead, in their beds. The walls were covered in spray-painted messages like a deranged intruder had broken in, religious slurs, threats, anger aimed at Chris's job. But the scene felt staged, and it didn't take long for the facade to collapse. Security cameras showed Chris's car still in the driveway after the time he claimed to have left for the gym. His phone records contradicted his story. His timeline kept changing, and handwriting experts concluded that the same person wrote the threatening emails and the graffiti on the walls. That person was Chris. The motive was chilling in its simplicity. He wanted a new life with Tara. He wanted freedom. He wanted image without consequence. Investigators discovered he had booked a trip to Hawaii with Tara, even planning a vacation just weeks after the murders. Photos on his phone showed the couple smiling together while Sherry and the boys were still alive at home. The trial captured national attention. People were stunned that a man trusted to guard one of the most famous Christian figures in the country could coldly murder his own family. Prosecutors laid out the evidence piece by piece. The threatening emails came from a computer Chris had access to. His cell phone's GPS placed him near the home when he claimed he was elsewhere. The timeline of death contradicted his alibi. And the motive of his affair was undeniable. On May 5, 2011, exactly 2 years after the murders, Chris Coleman was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Sherry's family wept in court. Chris showed no emotion. Joyce Meyer herself later revealed something heartbreaking. She would not have fired Chris for divorcing his wife. Meaning all of this, the lies, the affair, the staged threats, and the murders, was for nothing. In prison, Chris has remained mostly silent, occasionally sending letters claiming innocence. But the evidence speaks louder than any words. He wanted a new life. Instead, he destroyed the one thing that truly made him human. For years, British tabloids couldn't get enough of Mick Philpott. He was the father of 17 children living under one roof with his wife, his mistress, and a chaotic but strangely functional family unit. He appeared on talk shows, laughed with hosts, complained loudly about the pressures of raising so many kids on government benefits. The media called him Mr. Britain's Big Family. He soaked up the attention, every camera flash, every headline, every interview. But behind the smirks and soundbites, Mick Philpott was not a lovable oddity. He was a violent, manipulative predator whose craving for control would ultimately lead to one of the most horrific crimes in modern British history. Mick's darkness didn't begin with the fire, it started decades earlier. As a teenager, he attacked one girlfriend with another woman he stabbed repeatedly when she tried to leave him. He controlled every partner he ever had, emotionally, physically, psychologically. By his 40 seconds, Mick had built what he considered his perfect arrangement. His wife Marie, his mistress Lisa Willis, and the children he had with both women, all living together, all under his command. He didn't work. He didn't need to. Government benefits paid for everything. He bragged that raising children was his job, and the media turned him into a spectacle. But in early 2012, the illusion collapsed. Lisa Willis, after enduring years of abuse, escaped. She took her 5 children with her and cut all ties with Mick. And for a man like him, this wasn't about heartbreak. It wasn't even about losing a partner. It was about losing control. And nothing enraged Mick Philpott more. He wanted revenge. He wanted sympathy. He wanted Lisa to look like a villain and himself to look like the grieving hero. So he created a plan that was as twisted as it was reckless. He would set fire to his own home, rescue his children, and blame Lisa. He believed the public would rally behind him. He believed the courts would return custody. He believed he would be celebrated as the father who tried to save his kids. He believed because Mick Philpott had always believed he was smarter than everyone else. On May 11, 2012, the early hours before sunrise, Mick Marie and their friend Paul Mosley carried out the plan. They poured petrol inside the home's hallway and set it alight. The children sleeping in their bedrooms had no warning. When the flames erupted, Mick and Marie ran outside screaming for help as cameras rolled. Mick collapsed onto the pavement, wailing dramatically for reporters. He cried into his hands. He shouted that he'd tried to save them. But it was all an act. The 6 children, Jade, John, Jack, Jesse, Jaden, and Dwayne, never had a chance. They all died from smoke inhalation before firefighters could reach them. Britain mourned. Donations poured in. Sympathy flowed. For a moment, Mick got exactly what he wanted. But investigators weren't convinced. The fire started inside the house. There was no sign of forced entry. The accelerant matched the petrol Mick had purchased the day before, and witnesses came forward saying Mick had spoken openly about getting custody back. Under pressure, Marie cracked. She admitted the fire was staged. Prosecutors revealed the horrifying truth to the jury. 6 children were dead because their father wanted to frame his ex-mistress and reclaim public sympathy. It wasn't grief. It wasn't insanity. It was ego. Mick Philpott thought he could create a tragedy, survive it, and emerge as a hero. On April 4, 2013, Mick Philpott was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 15 years. Marie and Paul Mosley received 17 years each. In court, Mick showed no remorse. He smirked. He joked. He blamed everyone but himself. Even in prison, he continued to stir headlines, violent altercations, manipulative behavior, explosive interviews. To this day, the Philpott fire remains a symbol of the darkest human impulses, a man willing to sacrifice his own children, not for love, not for desperation, but for attention, control, and pride. A tragedy not born from a moment of madness, but from a lifetime of selfishness. To the outside world, John Emil List looked like the definition of American respectability. A devout Lutheran, a soft-spoken accountant, a husband and father who attended church every Sunday with his tie perfectly straightened. He lived with his family in Breeze Knoll, a sprawling 19-room Victorian mansion in Westfield, New Jersey, the kind of home that symbolized success and stability. But inside those walls, behind the stained glass skylight and carefully trimmed hedges, John List's life was quietly crumbling. He had been raised in a strict German-American household where discipline, religion, and order weren't just values, they were commandments. And as an adult, those same rigid expectations became the bars of a cage he could never escape. His wife Helen suffered from alcoholism and long-hidden health issues, including syphilis contracted from her first husband. Her illness made her emotionally volatile, bitter, and fragile. Divorce, however, was unthinkable to John. In his mind, ending the marriage would condemn him in the eyes of God, and so he stayed silently suffocating under the weight of obligation. Meanwhile, his career was falling apart. When he lost yet another accounting job, he was too ashamed to admit it. So every morning he put on his suit, gathered his briefcase, kissed his family goodbye, and instead of going to work, he sat all day in the train station, reading newspapers. Breeze Knoll, with its grand hallways and expensive upkeep, was swallowing the family financially. Bills piled up. His mother's savings were dwindling, and behind his calm exterior, John List was unraveling. In his mind, he saw signs everywhere that the world was decaying morally. Television, youth culture, modern society, corrupting his children, Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick. His fear twisted into conviction. He believed their souls were in danger, that financial ruin would drag them into sin, that God expected him to act, and from that delusion, a plan formed, cold, methodical, and horrifying. On the morning of November 9th, 1971, John woke early, dressed in a dark suit, and went downstairs with 2 handguns he had carefully prepared. He walked into the kitchen where Helen was drinking her morning coffee, aimed and shot her in the back of the head. There was no hesitation, no second thoughts, just the quiet execution of a decision he had already made. Then he climbed the stairs to his mother's apartment. She barely had time to ask what the noise was before he shot her too, a single bullet to the head. When Patricia and Frederick returned from school later that day, John met them in the hallway and killed them one after another. Finally, he waited for his oldest son, John Jr., to come home from soccer practice. Some investigators believe the oldest boy resisted his death, showed signs of a struggle, as if he had fought in those final moments, and that detail became one of the most chilling parts of the case. John then arranged the bodies of his wife and 3 children on sleeping bags in the mansion's ballroom. His mother, too heavy to move, remained upstairs with a towel covering her face. And then in a scene that still haunts investigators, John walked to his study, sat down, and wrote a 5-page letter to his pastor. In it, he explained that he had killed his family to save their souls. He believed death would deliver them to heaven before moral corruption could claim them. To him, this wasn't murder, it was salvation. Before leaving Breeze Knoll forever, he turned down the thermostat to slow decomposition. He cut his face out of every family photograph to hinder police. He left organ music playing through the mansion's intercom system, creating an eerie soundtrack for anyone who would eventually walk inside. Then, he locked the doors, got into his car, and vanished. For a month, neighbors noticed something strange. Lights burning, day and night, mail stacking up, no voices, no movement. When police finally entered the dark, silent mansion, they found what one reporter later called a mausoleum of quiet. The bodies laid out in the ballroom. The letter waiting neatly on the desk. The organ music still echoing through the hallways, and no sign of the man who did it. John List had disappeared without a trace. For 18 years he lived under a new name, Robert Clark. He moved to Denver, joined a local Lutheran church, remarried, and worked quietly as an accountant again. He blended into the crowd so perfectly, no one ever suspected the mild-mannered church-going man had murdered his entire family. His capture came in one of the most extraordinary moments in television crime history. In 1989, America's Most Wanted aired a segment on the case. Forensic artist Frank Bender sculpted an age-progressed clay bust predicting what John might look like after nearly 2 decades. The bust was uncannily accurate down to the glasses and receding hairline. A neighbor in Virginia saw the episode and recognized him instantly. Within days, the FBI arrested Robert Clark, who, after hours of questioning, finally admitted, "Yes, I am John List." During his 1990 trial, the defense argued mental illness, that he was broken, delusional, overwhelmed by religious pressure. But the prosecution painted a different picture, a man who planned every detail with chilling precision, a man who murdered not in panic but in calculation, a man who valued reputation over life. The jury found him guilty of 5 counts of murder, and he was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms. Even in later interviews, John List showed little remorse. He expressed regret for the loss of life, but maintained that he believed death had spared his family from moral decay. He died in prison in 2008, still convinced that his actions had been righteous. Breeze Knoll burned down mysteriously in 1972, just months after the bodies were discovered. The mansion turned to ash, but the story remains one of the darkest examples of domestic betrayal in American history. A father who believed he was saving his family by destroying it. In Wichita, Kansas, Dennis Rader lived a life so ordinary that no one ever thought to look twice. He was the president of his church council, a Boy Scout troop leader, a city compliance officer who enforced neighborhood codes with precision. He had a wife, 2 children, a tidy home decorated with Bible verses and family portraits. He mowed his lawn every weekend. He waved to neighbors. He taught his kids to pray before dinner. If you walked past him on the street, you would think he was the safest man in town. But beneath that calm suburban surface lived one of the most calculated serial killers in American history, a man who named himself BTK, short for bind, torture, kill. His double life began in 1974. At the time, Dennis worked for a home security company, a job that gave him an intimate understanding of how families protected themselves. That same year, he chose his first victims, the Otero family. On January 15th, in broad daylight, he broke into their house, armed, prepared, and terrifyingly calm. By the end of the morning, both parents and 2 of their children were dead. For Wichita, a quiet city where people rarely locked their doors, the brutality was unimaginable. But for Dennis Rader, it was only the beginning. He didn't just want to kill, he wanted to be known. He wrote letters to the police and local newspapers, taunting investigators, describing his crimes in chilling detail and demanding they call him by the name he created, BTK. In those letters, he laid out his twisted code as if it were a brand: bind them, torture them, kill them, believing the world needed to recognize his work. Over the next 3 decades, he murdered again and again. Young women, mothers, a widow living alone. His victims rarely had anything in common except this: he chose them, studied them, stalked them, and waited for the perfect moment. He wrote stories and sketches about his fantasies. He photographed himself, bound in ropes, recreating his crimes in secret. BTK wasn't a mask Dennis put on. It was the truth. Beneath the mask, he showed everyone else. Meanwhile, his public life thrived. He married a quiet, devoted woman named Paula in 1971. He became a father. He kept a strict home. He read scripture at church. At work, he was known for being rigid, demanding, even petty over small violations. But no one suspected the darkness hiding behind his rulebook and polite smiles. His ability to blend into everyday life was his greatest camouflage. By 1991, the murders stopped, or so it appeared. For over a decade, Wichita believed BTK had died or gone to prison. The city healed. People let down their guard. Dennis continued his life as usual: churchyard, work, city inspections. But inside, the desire for recognition simmered, waiting for a spark. In 2004, on the 30th anniversary of the Otero murders, a local newspaper published a feature suggesting BTK was likely gone forever. That article ignited something inside Dennis. He couldn't stand the idea of being forgotten. He needed the world to remember him. And so, after years of silence, he sent a letter to the media claiming responsibility for a cold case from the 1,980 seconds, and including photos and items taken from the victim's home. BTK was back. Over the next year, he sent packages, dull recreations of murders, and long messages boasting about his crimes. But this time, technology had advanced far beyond what existed in the 70 seconds. In 2005, Dennis sent a floppy disk to a TV station, asking police if they could trace it, and believing their false assurance that they could not. They traced it within minutes. The metadata led investigators straight to a computer at Christ Lutheran Church. The username Dennis Rader. A DNA sample from his daughter's medical records confirmed the genetic match. After nearly 31 years of hunting, Wichita police surrounded his vehicle on February 25, 2005. When officers asked if he knew why he was being arrested, Dennis answered calmly, "I have suspicions why." During interrogation, he spoke for over 30 hours, recounting each murder with a chilling lack of emotion, describing the deaths of men, women, and children as if he were reading instructions from a manual. Detectives later said he confessed to murder the same way he explained how to fix a lawnmower: methodical, detached, disturbingly proud. Wichita couldn't believe it. Their friendly neighbor, their church leader, their city inspector, this was the monster who had terrorized them for decades. In court, when asked why he killed, he said, "I had this fantasy life. I had to live it out." He pleaded guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder. During his confession, he stood at a podium and gave a step-by-step description of each killing. No remorse, no hesitation, no emotion. He was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms, totaling 175 years without parole. Even behind bars, Dennis's need for attention didn't stop. He wrote letters to journalists, hinted at other fantasies, and watched documentaries about himself, the only audience he had left. In recent years, from 2023 to 2025, cold case investigators in Kansas and Oklahoma reopened several disappearances that may be linked to him. They searched his old writings and photos looking for clues. Even decades later, BTK still casts a shadow over the Midwest. Dennis Rader proved a terrifying truth: sometimes monsters aren't strangers lurking in the dark. Sometimes they're standing beside you in church, holding a Bible, smiling politely, hiding unspeakable cruelty behind the mask of an ordinary man. For years, Ruby Franke was held up as the perfect American mother. Millions of viewers tuned in to her YouTube channel, 8 passengers to watch what looked like a wholesome, disciplined, God-centered family. Her 6 children appeared in carefully curated videos: morning routines, chore charts, family prayers, lessons about obedience and responsibility. Ruby spoke with conviction, telling her audience that good parenting required toughness, structure, and unwavering faith. She became a symbol of good Christian motherhood, the kind audiences trusted without question. But behind the polished thumbnails and the spotless Utah home, something far darker was growing. The discipline Ruby preached online, strict rules, harsh consequences, emotional control, was no longer just for the camera. It was tightening around her children's lives like a vice. Over the years, her punishments became more extreme. She once filmed herself saying she denied her son food because he forgot his lunch at school. In another video, she revealed that one daughter had been forced to sleep on a beanbag for months. Critics began warning that her philosophy bordered on abuse. Her supporters dismissed it as tough love. The truth was much worse. When Ruby's husband Kevin moved out in 2021, after growing alarmed by her increasingly rigid behavior, Ruby didn't soften, she hardened, and she found someone who encouraged it. Her name was Jodi Hildebrandt, a self-proclaimed life counselor who ran a group called Connections, an organization promoting extreme forms of accountability, moral purity, and emotional isolation. To Jodi, children were sinners who needed correction. To Ruby, Jodi's teachings weren't alarming, they were validating. The two became inseparable, feeding each other's worst instincts under the banner of righteousness. By 2023, Ruby's online presence had shifted from cheerful vlogs to unsettling lectures about repentance, confession, and punishment. Her children began disappearing from videos. Fans assumed the older ones moved out. No one realized the younger two had been pulled into a nightmare, hidden behind closed blinds. That nightmare finally broke open on August 30th, 2023. In Ivins, Utah, a frail 1-2-year-old boy, Ruby's son, escaped through a window of Jodi Hildebrandt's home. His body was skeletal. His arms and legs were covered in open wounds, rope marks, and layers of duct tape. Starvation had left him trembling. Desperation had driven him to flee. He ran to a neighbor's house and whispered that he needed help, that he had been tied up, that others were still inside suffering. Police arrived and found his 10-year-old sister in similar condition, malnourished, filthy, terrified. The home was a scene of psychological and physical torment, and Ruby Franke, the woman millions admired for her parenting, was arrested within hours. When investigators dug deeper, the full scope of the abuse came into view. Ruby and Jodi had imposed extreme punishments under the guise of spiritual correction: starvation, isolation, physical restraint, emotional indoctrination. They called it training. Prosecutors called it torture. The world watched in shock as the wholesome YouTube mom appeared in court, gaunt, hollow, unrecognizable. Gone was the bright smile, the tidy home, the moral lectures. In its place stood a woman who had crossed a line so far into fanaticism that even her own children hadn't realized how dangerous she had become. During her plea hearing, Ruby broke down. Through tears, she admitted that she had allowed herself to be consumed by Jodi Hildebrandt's teachings. "I chose to follow someone who convinced me that evil was good," she said. "My actions caused unimaginable harm, but apologies couldn't heal what she had done." On February 20th, 2024, Ruby Franke was sentenced to 4 consecutive prison terms of 1 to 15 years, effectively up to 60 years. Jodi Hildebrandt received the same sentence. The judge called their behavior a distortion of love turned into domination, a line that echoed across headlines for days. But the tragedy didn't end in the courtroom. After being rescued, the Franke children entered the foster system, hoping for safety. Instead, in 2024, yet another scandal erupted. The foster parents assigned to care for several of them were charged with severe abuse and sexual assault. The system meant to protect them failed again. It was a devastating reminder that escape does not always mean freedom. Today, Ruby's older children, those who left years earlier, speak publicly about healing therapy and rebuilding. The younger ones remain shielded from the public eye as they recover from years of suffering. Ruby's son Jordan, whose courage saved his siblings, has become an advocate for survivors, speaking softly but bravely in interviews about the night he escaped and how he practiced dialing 911 long before he even understood what safety felt like. The fall of Ruby Franke is not just the story of a mother gone astray. It is the collapse of an entire digital illusion, a reminder that family vlogging can hide exploitation, that perfection on camera means nothing, and that love twisted into control can become one of the most dangerous forces of all. Because sometimes the most polished families, the ones who preach the loudest about morality, are the ones hiding the darkest secrets behind the lens. In every one of these stories, the world saw only the surface first. A smiling husband, a devoted mother, a respected father, a quiet neighbor, a family with matching outfits, a home filled with prayer. Each of these households projected an image that felt safe, familiar, even admirable. But behind the photographs, behind the Bible verses and weekend routines, behind the curated social media posts and cheerful public personas, there were cracks, tiny fractures no one noticed, shadows no one dared to examine, lies no one thought to question. Chris Watts filmed family videos while dreaming of a life without his family. Alex Murdaugh walked through courtrooms he once dominated, hiding theft, addiction, and murder behind his southern charm. Jean-Claude Romand built a career that never existed, an imaginary life so detailed he sacrificed reality to protect it. Josef Fritzl created a second world underground, one of unimaginable suffering, while playing the part of a strict yet ordinary father above. The Turpin family posted smiling portraits, while their children starved behind closed doors. Chris Coleman prayed with television evangelists, while planning the death of his wife and sons. Mick Philpott bragged on talk shows, unaware the world would soon learn he burned his own children for attention. John List sat in church pews while convincing himself that murder was salvation. Dennis Rader enforced community rules and preached obedience while writing letters signed with the words, bind, torture. Ruby Franke taught millions how to raise children right, even as her own lived in fear, starvation, and pain. 10 families, 10 facades, 10 nightmares, hiding behind smiles, reputations, religious devotion, or digital perfection. What binds them all is not how they lived, but how they hid. In each case, the world believed the mask, believed the pictures, believed what these people wanted others to see, believed that evil always comes from outside, believed that a perfect family must be a safe one. But the truth is far more unsettling. Evil doesn't always lurk in dark alleys or abandoned streets. Sometimes it sleeps in the bedroom down the hall. Sometimes it laughs in family portraits. Sometimes it prays before dinner. Sometimes it films bedtime routines for millions of followers. Sometimes it waves politely to neighbors on the way to church. Sometimes it carries a Bible in one hand and a secret in the other. These stories are not just about killers. They are about the illusions we accept because they are easier to believe than the truth. They show us that perfection can be a costume, that kindness can be a performance, and that the most terrifying monsters are often the ones skilled at blending in. Each family hid their darkness differently, but in the end, the lesson is the same. Pay attention to the shadows behind the smiles. Pay attention to what feels too perfect. Pay attention to the silence no one asks about. Pay attention to the stories that don't quite match the pictures, because sometimes the most ordinary homes hold the darkest secrets of all. And in these cases, the mask didn't just slip, it shattered. One truth remains across every story we've explored. Evil doesn't always break into the home. Sometimes it lives there.